If you walked into a Wild West saloon in 1870, you weren't just stepping into a bar. You were stepping into survival. The air was thick with smoke, the smell of unwashed bodies, and the burn of something they called coffin varnish, whiskey. For over a century, Hollywood has shown these places as stages for gunfights and legends. But the truth? It was far darker. Behind those swinging doors, fortunes were lost in seconds, lives ended over a single card, and deals were made that quietly shaped the future of a nation. This is the story of the frontier hub as you've never heard it before. From rough wooden walls built in mud to the desperate mines that filled them, and the violent collapse of an institution that once ruled the West. So step inside, and if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Number 26. Frontier life and the psychological need for the saloon. To understand why the saloon became the most important building in any Western town, one must first understand the sheer soul-crushing weight of frontier life. The American West in the 19th century was not a playground for adventurers. It was a brutal landscape of extreme temperatures, physical exhaustion, and a level of loneliness that modern minds can scarcely comprehend. Miners spent 14 hours a day in dark, damp tunnels, risking cave-ins and lung disease for the hope of a golden strike. Cowboys spent months on the trail, surrounded by nothing but cattle and the indifferent stars, often going weeks without speaking to another human being. When these men finally settled, they weren't just looking for a drink. They were looking for a reminder that they were still part of the human race. The saloon provided a psychological refuge that no other institution could offer, serving as a sanctuary from the howling winds and the indifferent wilderness. It was the emotional and social core of the frontier, a communal living room for those who had no home, and a theater of human interaction that kept the darkness of the wilderness at bay for just a few hours more. Number 25. The humble origins, Brown's Hall and the Trapper era. The lineage of the legendary Western saloon does not begin with polished mahogany and crystal chandeliers, but rather with the grit and grime of the fur trade. Long before the gold rush brought thousands of dreamers to the West, the first documented establishment that could be called a saloon emerged in 1822. Known as Brown's Hall, this rudimentary structure sat near the intersection of what is now Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah. It was not a place of refinement, it was a functional outpost designed specifically for fur trappers and traders who spent their lives in the mountains. At this stage, the saloon was little more than a fortified hut where men could exchange pelts for basic necessities, including the roughest forms of distilled spirits. There were no brass footrails or ornate mirrors here. The floors were often packed earth, and the bar was likely a plank of wood resting on two barrels. The atmosphere was one of utilitarian survival, yet it established the fundamental blueprint for everything that would follow. It proved that in the vast emptiness of the West, a centralized location for trade and socialization was not just a luxury, but a necessity. Brown's Hall served as the prototype for the frontier social hub, demonstrating that wherever men gathered for work, they would inevitably seek a place to congregate, share information, and dull the pain of their labor with alcohol. This early era of the saloon was defined by its simplicity and its direct connection to the land, serving a transient population of mountain men who were as rugged and unrefined as the structures they frequented. These humble beginnings laid the groundwork for a cultural phenomenon that would eventually explode in scale and sophistication as the frontier moved further west. Number 24. The Gold Rush expansion, tents, mud, and instant towns. When gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in 1848, the evolution of the saloon accelerated at a dizzying pace. As hundreds of thousands of 49ers descended upon California and later other mining regions, towns appeared literally overnight. In these chaotic, burgeoning settlements, the saloon was often the very first permanent or semi-permanent structure to be erected. In the earliest days of a strike, a saloon might consist of nothing more than a large canvas tent with a board laid across two crates to serve as a bar. They were the centers of information where new arrivals could learn which creeks were panning out and where the latest claims were being staked. As the tent cities evolved into wooden settlements, the saloons evolved with them, moving from canvas to rough-hewn lumber. This era saw the birth of the instant town, where a single street might be lined with a dozen saloons before a single church or schoolhouse had even been discussed. The sheer volume of alcohol consumed during this period was staggering, as miners sought to celebrate their find or drown the sorrows of a dry claim. The gold rush transformed the saloon from a rare outpost into a ubiquitous feature of the American landscape, cementing its role as the primary engine of frontier commerce and social life. Number 23. Growth alongside frontier towns, from outposts to institutions. As the initial chaos of the various resource rushes began to settle, the saloons of the Old West underwent a period of dramatic professionalization and physical growth. What started as a temporary necessity became a permanent pillar of town development. As the settlement stabilized, the saloon keepers began to invest in their properties, recognizing that a more comfortable and impressive establishment would attract a wealthier and more loyal clientele. This growth was intrinsically linked to the arrival of the railroad, which acted as a lifeline for the frontier. The Iron Horse brought more than just settlers. It brought the materials necessary to build the grand saloons we recognize today. Polished wood from the East, massive mirrors from Europe, and heavy glass bottles replaced the rough lumber and ceramic jugs of the earlier era. Some became known for their gambling, others for their food, and some for the quality of their musical entertainment. The saloon grew alongside the town, often acting as the unofficial town hall where political meetings were held, trials were conducted, and community decisions were made. By the mid to late 19th century, the saloon had become a sophisticated business enterprise, deeply integrated into the economic fabric of the West and serving as the primary face of frontier prosperity. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the grit and grime of the frontier, you're exactly where you belong. Stories like these are being erased from history, but we're bringing them back to life every single week. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to join our posse here at Historical Lore. Don't let the true story of the West fade into the dust. Stay tuned, because the facts are about to get much darker. Number 22. Architecture and the physical layout of a legend. The physical design of the classic Wild West Saloon was a masterclass in functional social engineering, designed to facilitate movement, interaction, and, most importantly, the consumption of spirits. The centerpiece of any establishment was the bar, a long, heavy stretch of wood, often mahogany or oak, that spanned the length of the main room. This bar was more than just a table. It was a barrier and a stage. A brass footrail ran along the bottom, allowing patrons to shift their weight and stand comfortably for hours at a time. Behind the bar, a massive mirror was almost always present, not just for aesthetics, but to allow the bartender to keep an eye on the entire room without turning his back on the patrons. A vital safety feature in a world where tempers could flare in an instant. The floor was usually covered in sawdust to soak up spilled beer, tobacco juice, and the occasional splash of blood, making cleanup at the end of the night a simple matter of sweeping. Unlike modern bars where people sit on stools, many Old West saloons were standing room only at the bar itself, which encouraged men to move around and socialize. Tables were scattered throughout the rest of the room, primarily used for gambling or shared meals. Spittoons were placed every few feet, a necessary concession to the universal habit of chewing tobacco. The layout was intentionally open, creating a sense of communal space where everyone was visible to everyone else. This architecture reinforced the saloon's role as a public square, a place where privacy was non-existent, and the collective energy of the crowd was the primary draw. Every element, from the height of the bar to the placement of the piano, was tuned to create an environment that was both rowdy and regulated by the physical boundaries of the space. Number 21. Regional variations, from Texas horns to San Francisco silk. While the basic blueprint of the saloon remained consistent, the decor and atmosphere varied wildly depending on the geographic region and the local economy. In the cosmopolitan hubs of the West Coast, such as San Francisco or Seattle, saloons often rivaled the finest hotels in New York or London. These palace saloons featured velvet curtains, crystal chandeliers, and intricate woodwork, catering to wealthy merchants and successful mining magnates who demanded a level of refinement. In these establishments, the untold side of the West was one of extreme opulence, where the best French champagnes were served alongside the finest cigars. Contrast this with the saloons of Texas and the Great Plains, where the decor was dictated by the cattle industry. Here, you would find walls adorned with massive longhorn racks, branding irons, and saddles. The atmosphere was dustier, the furniture more rugged, and the clientele almost exclusively composed of cowboys and ranchers. In the mountain regions of Colorado and Montana, saloons took on the character of hunting lodges, with the walls covered in the trophies of the wilderness, which include elk heads, bear skins, and stuffed mountain lions. The saloon was a canvas upon which the local culture was painted, reflecting the unique identity of the people who called that specific corner of the frontier home. Number 20. The internal atmosphere, smoke, noise, and sweat. Stepping into an Old West saloon was a sensory assault that few modern people could truly imagine. The air was a thick blue haze of tobacco smoke, so dense that it often obscured the far corners of the room. This was layered with the pungent scent of unwashed bodies, the sour smell of spilled beer fermenting in the sawdust, and the sharp tang of cheap whiskey. It was never quiet. The atmosphere was a constant cacophony of shouting voices, the clinking of glasses, the rhythmic thumping of boots on floorboards, and the tinkling of a tin-pan piano that was usually out of tune. In many establishments, the walls were decorated with provocative paintings, often nudes, which were a shock to the sensibilities of polite society but a staple of the male-dominated saloon environment. These paintings, along with the ornate bars and glittering mirrors, provided a visual escape from the brown and gray reality of the frontier. The environment was intentionally designed to be immersive and overwhelming, a place where a man could lose himself in the crowd. There was a peculiar sense of equality in this atmosphere. The behind-closed-doors reality was that the saloon was a pressure cooker of human emotion, where the joy of companionship was always balanced on the razor's edge of potential conflict. Number 19. Alcohol, coffin varnish, and the chemistry of despair. The alcohol served in the average Wild West saloon was a far cry from the regulated, aged spirits of today. While the legendary bourbon of Kentucky did make its way west via the railroads, much of what was consumed was a terrifying chemical concoction brewed in backrooms or local distilleries. This liquid, frequently referred to as whiskey, was often raw grain alcohol stretched with a horrifying array of additives designed to give it color, bite, and the appearance of age. To achieve the deep amber hue of aged whiskey, saloon keepers might add burnt sugar, molasses, or even tobacco juice. To give it a kick, they were known to add strychnine, red pepper, or even battery acid. These additives didn't just make the drink harsh, they made it dangerous. The nicknames for these drinks are coffin varnish, bug juice, red eye, and firewater, which were not metaphors. They were literal descriptions of the effect. the liquid had on the throat and the internal organs. Drinking in a saloon was not about savoring a bouquet or enjoying a complex flavor profile. It was about achieving a rapid and total state of intoxication to forget the miseries of frontier life. The high alcohol content and toxic additives often led to whiskey fits or bouts of extreme aggression and paranoia, which fueled much of the violence associated with the era. This was the banned story of the saloon bar, that the very product being sold was often a slow-acting poison that eroded the health and sanity of the men who drank it. The demand for alcohol was so high that quality was irrelevant. As long as it burned on the way down and provided a momentary escape, the patrons would keep coming back for more, unknowingly consuming substances that would be considered hazardous waste by modern standards. It's hard to imagine surviving a single glass of coffin varnish, let alone making it a daily habit. But we want to hear from you. If you were transported back to 1875, would you have the stomach to survive the Wild West saloon culture, or would the bud juice be the end of you? Drop a comment below with the most shocking thing you've learned so far. We respond to the best insights, and your input helps us decide which untold story we cover next. Number 18. The beer problem, warm brews, and the ice revolution. For the first several decades of the Old West era, beer was a secondary and often disappointing option compared to whiskey. The primary issue was the complete lack of consistent refrigeration. Beer in the 19th century was usually served at room temperature, which, in a desert town in July, meant it was lukewarm and often sour. Because it was unpasteurized and difficult to transport without spoiling, most beer was brewed locally and had a very short shelf life. It was often cloudy, heavy, and prone to rapid fermentation in the bottle or keg, leading to frequent skunking. This changed dramatically in the 1880s when Adolphus Busch introduced artificial refrigeration and the use of refrigerated rail cars. This technological breakthrough was a turning point in saloon history. Suddenly, it was possible to transport stable, clear, cold lager from massive breweries in St. Louis or Milwaukee to the furthest reaches of the frontier. The cold beer sign became one of the most powerful marketing tools in the West, promising a level of refreshment that was previously impossible. This ice revolution shifted the drinking habits of the frontier, making beer a formidable rival to whiskey. It also led to the rise of the tied house system, where a brewery would own the saloon and require it to sell only their brand of beer. This brought a new level of corporate organization to the Wild West, as national brands began to displace local moonshiners. The transition from warm, muddy ale to crisp, cold lager represented the civilizing of the West, a move away from the raw, dangerous spirits of the early days toward a more regulated and commercialized form of leisure. Number 17. Pricing and the economics of the frontier. The cost of a drink in a Wild West saloon was rarely a fixed thing. It was a volatile figure influenced by the brutal laws of supply and demand. In a remote mining camp in the Sierras, a single shot of whiskey could cost as much as a gram of gold, an astronomical price for the time. This was because every drop of alcohol had to be hauled in by mule train or wagon over treacherous mountain passes, with the shipping costs often exceeding the value of the liquid itself. In contrast, in a major railhead like Abilene or Wichita, competition was fierce and prices were much lower. Some saloons would offer a free lunch to anyone who bought a nickel beer, a spread of salty meats, crackers, and pickles designed to make the patron thirsty so they would buy more drinks. This economic strategy is the origin of the phrase, "There's no such thing as a free lunch." The untold economic reality was that the saloon was the primary engine of wealth redistribution in a town. It was where the hard-earned wages of miners and cowboys were funneled back into the pockets of the business class. Saloon keepers were often the wealthiest men in town, serving as unofficial bankers who would hold a man's poke, his bag of gold, or cash for safekeeping in a safe behind the bar. This gave the saloon keeper immense power over the community, as he controlled both the social life and the liquid assets of the population. The pricing of drinks, the quality of the free lunch, and the willingness to extend credit were the levers by which the saloon keeper managed the local economy, making the establishment a financial fortress as much as a social club. Number 16. Gambling, the heartbeat of the saloon. While drinking was the primary excuse to enter a saloon, gambling was the activity that kept men there for hours or even days at a time. In the Old West, gambling was not seen as a fringe vice, but as a central part of masculine culture. The most popular game by far was faro, a fast-paced card game where players bet on the order in which cards would be drawn from a dealing box. Faro was known as bucking the tiger, and it was so addictive that many saloons were primarily gambling houses that happened to serve alcohol. Other games included poker, which was slower and more strategic, dice, and various short change games like three-card Monte, and it was frequently rigged. Professional gamblers traveled from town to town, carrying marked decks, shaved dice, and dealing boxes with hidden springs. These card sharps were experts at reading people and manipulating the odds, and the saloon keeper often took a percentage of their winnings in exchange for letting them operate in the establishment. Gambling provided the high-stakes excitement that mirrored the risks of frontier life, the all-in mentality of the miner who might strike it rich or go broke in a single day. However, it was also the single greatest source of conflict. Disputes over a crooked deal or a hidden ace were the catalyst for more saloon violence than any other factor. The quiet tension of a high-stakes game, with thousands of dollars in gold dust on the table and every man's hand hovering near his holster, was the true essence of the Wild West Saloon, a place where fortunes were made and lost in the time it took to flip a card. Number 15. Entertainment and the rise of specialization. As the West became more populated and civilized, the simple drinking hole began to branch out into various forms of specialized entertainment. The term saloon became a catch-all for a variety of establishments. There were dance halls, where the primary draw was the opportunity to pay for a dance with a woman, billiard halls, where the focus was on pool and snooker, and variety theaters, which featured stage acts ranging from Shakespearean monologues to bawdy comedy and acrobatic displays. Some of the larger saloons became 24-hour operations, never closing their doors to the restless population of the frontier. These establishments were the ancestors of the modern casino resorts, offering food, drink, gambling, and a show all under one roof. The specialization reflected a growing social stratification. A man could choose a saloon that catered specifically to his interests and his social standing. The untold story here is the sheer level of creativity saloon keepers used to attract customers. Some kept menageries of wild animals like bears or wolves in cages to draw in the curious. Others invested in the latest technologies like the phonograph or early motion picture machines to provide a wonder that people couldn't find anywhere else. The saloon was the primary cultural venue of the West, the only place where a laborer could see a professional musical performance or a world-class athlete. This drive for entertainment transformed the saloon from a dark corner for drinkers into a bright, multifaceted entertainment complex that served as the Broadway of the Plain. Number 14. Social composition, the great equalizer. One of the most fascinating truths about the Wild West Saloon was its role as a social melting pot. In the rigid society of the 19th century East, social classes rarely mingled. But in the West, the saloon bar was a place where an outlaw on the run might stand shoulder to shoulder with the town's mayor, or where a wealthy mining engineer might buy a round for a group of destitute laborers. Because survival on the frontier was so precarious, the traditional markers of status were often stripped away. A man was judged by his word, his ability to work, and his conduct at the bar. Saloons were one of the few places where different ethnic and social groups interacted with any frequency, though this equality had its limits. While Irish, German, and Italian immigrants were generally welcomed, other groups faced much harsher barriers. Nevertheless, for the white male population, the saloon was a democratic space. This social composition created a unique frontier etiquette where personal history was often ignored. It was considered extremely rude and dangerous to ask a man about his past or his real name. Many men in the West were there to reinvent themselves, escaping debt, failed marriages, or criminal records in the East. The saloon respected this clean slate policy, allowing men from all walks of life to coexist in a shared space as long as they followed the unwritten rules of the house. This blend of outlaws, lawmen, workers, and dreamers created a vibrant, if volatile, social fabric that was unique to the American West. Number 13. The role of women, beyond the saloon girl myth. The history of women in the Wild West Saloon is often reduced to a few tropes, but the reality was a complex web of economic survival and social defiance. While respectable, women, married wives of town leaders or school teachers, would never dream of setting foot inside a saloon. The establishment provided a rare, albeit difficult, path to financial independence for others. Women in saloons were generally categorized into three roles: the barmaid, the entertainer, and the saloon girl. Contrary to popular belief, the primary job of a saloon girl was not necessarily prostitution, though the lines were often blurred. Her main function was to be a hostess who encouraged men to drink. These women were the lifeblood of the saloon's economy. They would sit with lonely miners, listen to their stories, and coax them into buying bottles of what was usually colored water for the girl and expensive whiskey for the man. The girl received a commission on every drink sold, and a clever girl could earn more in a night than a laborer made in a month. Notable figures like Julia Bulette in Virginia City became legendary, not just for their beauty, but for their business acumen and their genuine contributions to the community, such as funding fire departments or nursing the sick during epidemics. However, the life was brutal. They faced constant harassment, the threat of violence, and the social stigma of being fallen women. For many, The saloon was a golden cage, a place where they could earn enough money to survive in a world that offered women few other options, but at the cost of their reputation and often their health. The untold story of these women is one of grit and resilience, navigating a hyper-masculine environment with a sharp wit and a keen eye on the bottom line. Number 12. Restrictions and the invisible lines of the frontier. Despite the saloon's reputation as a place of freedom, it was governed by rigid, often discriminatory social boundaries that were rarely discussed but strictly enforced. These closed-door policies meant that the equality of the bar only extended to certain groups. In many territories, Native Americans were legally prohibited from purchasing alcohol or entering saloons, a restriction rooted in both racism and a patronizing fear of firewater, destabilizing the local population. Similarly, while some saloons were more integrated than others, Black pioneers often found themselves relegated to specific establishments or ignored at the bar in white-owned venues. These boundaries reflected the broader tensions of a nation struggling to define itself. Furthermore, the exclusion of respectable women created a gender-segregated world where the saloon became a bastion of unchecked masculinity. This absence of a civilizing female influence is often cited by historians as a reason for the rowdiness and violence of the era. The saloon was a sanctuary for the white male worker, but it was also a fortress that kept others out. These restrictions were not always posted on signs. They were understood through cold stares, a refusal of service, or the threat of force. Understanding who was not allowed in the saloon is just as important as understanding who was, as it reveals the deep-seated prejudices and social anxieties that the pioneers brought with them from the East and etched into the soil of the New West. Number 11. Customs and etiquette, the unwritten code of conduct. In a place where almost every man was armed and half were intoxicated, a strict code of etiquette was the only thing preventing total anarchy. The customs of the Wild West Saloon were designed to minimize friction and respect the anonymity that many frontiersmen craved. One of the most important rules was the use of first names or nicknames only. Asking a man for his full name, his hometown, or his business back east was considered a grave insult and a breach of privacy. On the frontier, a man was who he claimed to be in that moment, and his past was his own business. Another custom involved the space. At the bar, crowding a man or bumping into him without an immediate apology could be interpreted as a challenge to a duel. Conversation followed a similar pattern of guarded politeness. Controversial topics like politics or religion were often avoided unless the group was exceptionally friendly, as these were the sparks that ignited gunfights. This etiquette created a strange paradox. The saloon was the loudest, most boisterous place in town, yet it was governed by a level of formal restraint that would seem alien to a modern bar-goer. Violating these unwritten rules didn't just get you kicked out, it could get you killed. The saloon was a theater of performance where every man played the role of the gentleman of the road, masking his true intentions and history behind a facade of rough-hewn courtesy and measured speech. Number 8. The Death of a Legend, Wild Bill Hickok and the Dead Man's Hand. No story of saloon lore is complete without the chilling account of August 2, 1876, in Nuttall and Mann's Saloon No. 10 in Deadwood. Wild Bill Hickok, a legendary scout and lawman, was a creature of habit who always sat with his back to the wall so he could watch the door. On that fateful afternoon, the only available seat in his poker game forced him to sit with his back to the room. This lapse in judgment cost him his life. Jack McCall, a disgruntled drifter, walked into the saloon and shot Hickok in the back of the head. As Bill slumped over, he dropped his cards, a pair of black aces and a pair of black eights. To this day, that combination is known as the Dead Man's Hand. This incident is the quintessential saloon story, because it captures the inherent fragility of life in the West. Hickok was a man of immense skill and reputation, yet he was snuffed out in a moment of mundane relaxation. The aftermath of the shooting saw McCall nearly lynched, followed by a sham trial and his eventual execution. The story of the Dead Man's Hand cemented the saloon in the American consciousness as a place where fate was dealt from a deck of cards and where even the most famous figures were never truly safe. It transformed the Saloon Number 10 into a site of dark pilgrimage and served as a grim reminder to every other patron in the West, never turn your back on a closed door. Number 7. The influential figures. Beyond the outlaws, the Wild West Saloon was often owned and operated by the very men who were supposed to be keeping the peace. Figures like Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson were not just lawmen, they were savvy businessmen who recognized that the real power in a frontier town lay in the saloon. Wyatt Earp owned interests in saloons from Wichita to Tombstone, and even as far north as Nome, Alaska, during the gold rush there. For these men, the saloon was a source of steady income and a political headquarters. Being a saloon keeper meant you knew everyone's business, you controlled the flow of information, and you had the capital to influence town elections. These lawmen entrepreneurs bridged the gap between the wild frontier and the organized commerce of the future. Bat Masterson, known as a fierce gunfighter, spent much of his time managing gambling tables and ensuring that his establishments remained profitable. This dual identity, protector of the peace and purveyor of vice, is one of the most fascinating contradictions of the era. It shows that the saloon was not an outside force of chaos, but an inside pillar of the establishment. The men who built the West were often the same men who poured the drinks and dealt the cards, proving that in the 1800s the line between good and bad was as blurry as a drunkard's vision at midnight. Number 6. Legendary establishments. The Buckhorn and the Crystal Palace. While most saloons were fly-by-night operations, a few achieved a level of fame that allowed them to survive long after the frontier was closed. The Menger Bar in San Antonio, Texas, became a haunt for the elite and was famously the place where Theodore Roosevelt recruited his Rough Riders. The Buckhorn Exchange in Denver, Colorado opened in 1893 and became a museum of the West, with its walls covered in hundreds of taxidermy mounts and its bar serving the finest railroad magnates. In Tombstone, the Crystal Palace was renowned for its elegance, featuring a fountain in the center of the room and 24-hour service that catered to both the miners and the wealthy mine owners. These were the flagship saloons, the ones that appeared in newspapers back east and defined the glamour of the West. They stood as symbols of a town's permanence and success. To walk into the Crystal Palace was to feel that you had truly arrived. These historic saloons, some of which still stand today, provide a physical link to a vanished world. They were the cathedrals of the frontier, built with the same ambition and grandiosity as the cathedrals of Europe, designed to impress, to intimidate, and to provide a lasting legacy for the men who built them. Number 5. The Boston Saloon, a hidden history of refinement. One of the most remarkable and untold discoveries in recent archaeological history is the Boston Saloon in Virginia City, Nevada. Founded in the 1860s by William A.G. Brown, a free black man from Massachusetts, the Boston Saloon shattered every stereotype of the rough Western bar. Excavations have revealed that the patrons of the Boston Saloon were eating prime cuts of beef, drinking high-quality imported crystal bottled spirits, and using fine porcelain. Unlike the coffin varnish joints down the street, the Boston Saloon offered a refined atmosphere where African Americans and others could gather in a space of dignity and luxury. The discovery of oyster shells and French champagne bottles at the site proves that there was a black middle class in the West that demanded and received a high standard of service. This establishment is a crucial piece of historical lore because it proves that the saloon experience was not monolithic. There were spaces of sophistication and quiet respectability hidden amidst the chaos of the mining camps. The Boston Saloon stands as a testament to the diversity of the West and the fact that, even in a time of intense prejudice, individuals could carve out spaces of excellence and beauty behind closed doors. Number 4. The economic decline, industrialization, and the clock. The downfall of the Wild West Saloon was not caused by a single event, but by the slow, grinding gears of the Industrial Revolution. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, the nature of work changed. The rugged, independent miner and the free-roaming cowboy were replaced by factory workers and railroad employees who operated on strict schedules. Industrialists like Henry Ford and the titans of the mining corporations realized that a hungover workforce was an unproductive one. Employers began to demand sobriety as a condition of employment, and the wild lifestyle of the saloon came into direct conflict with the needs of a modern economy. At the same time, the closing of the frontier meant that towns were becoming more civilized and family-oriented. The bad story of the saloon's end is that it was simply outpaced by progress. The swinging doors were replaced by the ticking clock. As work became more structured and respectable, society grew more powerful. The rowdy, 24-hour saloon was seen as a relic of a dangerous past. The economic drivers that had made the saloon a necessity, that is, loneliness, lack of social venues, and raw resource extraction, were being replaced by theaters, parks, and professional sports. The saloon didn't just disappear, it was squeezed out by a world that no longer had room for its brand of unbridled, unpredictable freedom. Number 3. The moral crusade, prohibition, and the final curtain. The final nail in the coffin for the traditional saloon was the rise of the temperance movement. Led by groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League, the crusade against alcohol was framed as a battle for the soul of America. These activists didn't just want to ban alcohol, they wanted to destroy the saloon culture that they blamed for domestic violence, poverty, and political corruption. The image of the wicked saloon was used as a powerful political tool to push through the 18th Amendment. When Prohibition went into effect in 1909, the thousands of saloons across the West were forced to close their doors or transform into speakeasies and soft drink parlors. This was the literal end of the era. The architecture of the saloon, the long bars, the mirrors, the communal tables, was dismantled or hidden away. Prohibition succeeded in breaking the social power of the saloon, shifting drinking from a public, communal act to a private, often illicit one. By the time Prohibition was repealed in 1933, the world had changed too much for the old-style saloon to return. The historical lore of the West was now a matter for movies and books, as the physical spaces that had birthed the legends were either rotted away or turned into museums. The moral crusade had won, but in doing so, it erased a unique form of American social life that has never truly been replicated. Number 2. Legacy. The saloon as a cultural icon. Today, the Wild West Saloon lives on as the most potent symbol of the American frontier. It represents a time and place where the rules were different, where a man could be a hero or a villain based on a single night's events. Its influence is seen in everything from modern bar design to the tropes of Western cinema. We remember the saloon because it encapsulates the American spirit of risk, individualism, and the search for community in a vast, empty land. The untold legacy is that the saloon was the laboratory where the American identity was forged. It was in these rooms that the rough edges of different cultures were rubbed smooth, where a new kind of Western character was born, one that was resilient, skeptical of authority, and fiercely loyal to his comrades. The saloon is the stage upon which our national myths are played out, a place of shadows and light that continues to fascinate us over a century later. It remains the ultimate closed door of history, a space we can never truly enter again, but one that we will never stop trying to explore. Number 1. The shocking reality. The saloon as a medical nightmare. The most shocking fact about the Wild West Saloon is that, for many patrons, it functioned as the town's primary and most terrifying medical facility. In a world with few doctors and no hospitals, the saloon bar was often where surgery happened. If a man was shot, stabbed, or crushed in a mining accident, he was carried to the nearest saloon and laid out on the poker table. The anesthetic was a bottle of high-proof whiskey, and the surgeon was often the bartender or a local vet who used the same tools on humans as they did on horses. The mirrors and bright lights of the saloon provided the only adequate visibility for extracting bullets or sawing off gangrenous limbs. The sawdust on the floor, which we think of as a quaint decor choice, was actually there to soak up the massive amounts of blood and bodily fluids generated during these procedures. Furthermore, the whiskey itself was often used as a cure-all for everything from toothaches to cholera. leading to a population that was perpetually self-medicating with toxic chemicals. The saloon was not just a place of joy, it was a house of pain, a site of trauma, and a desperate, gore-splattered theater of survival. This is the reality that Hollywood leaves out. The same table where a man won a fortune at faro might, an hour later, be the place where he lost his leg to a rusty bone saw. The saloon was the thin, bloody line between life and death on the frontier, a place where the closed doors hid scenes of medical horror that would haunt the dreams of any modern observer. This was the true, unfiltered heart of the Wild West, a place of grit, rot, and a desperate, undying will to survive. The swinging doors of the Wild West Saloon have long since stopped moving, and the dust has settled over the blood and sawdust that once defined the American frontier. But the echoes of those high-stakes games, the scent of coffin varnish, and the ghosts of the men and women who risked everything for a moment of companionship still linger in the historical record. These weren't just buildings, they were the raw, beating heart of a nation in its most desperate and daring hour. If you've made it this far, you're now a keeper of the true historical lore that the history books often leave out. If this journey into the dark side of the West gripped you, make sure to like this video and share it with someone who thinks they know the real story of the frontier. Check out our other deep dives on the screen now to keep the history alive. Until next time, keep your back to the wall and your eyes on the door.